When winter returned without snow and she came with it, carrying silence in her coat pockets, leaving no words, only the unspoken weight of what was never said, but always understood in the quiet. Winter came early that year. It wasn't the kind that blanketed rooftops or turned roads into white silence. It arrived quietly, slipping in unnoticed, with cold, brittle air that crept under doors and stretched every sound until it felt distant, even within the same room. The signs showed themselves gradually. The floor tiles in the morning had a sharper chill. The sunlight, when it appeared, seemed diluted and disinterested. Even the laundry, which once crisped quickly on the line, now sagged in the cold, damp air slow to dry. But the house remained unchanged, in-jed in its arrangement. The hallway narrow and dim, the tea stain on the kitchen table still refusing to fade, the slow shuffle of her son's feet as he prepared for school echoing in the same tired rhythm. And then one afternoon, she came back. Her memory had become distant, reduced to occasional glimpses in strangers' gestures or in dreams that dissolved upon waking. Yet her arrival shattered that distance. She stood in the doorway without warning, bearing the weight of 13 years. Time had shaped her differently. Her hair was darker, her coat heavy with wet at the hem, but unmistakably it was her. She hesitated at the threshold, as though uncertain whether she belonged to the space she had once called home. She stepped inside, and the silence that followed was immediate and full. There was no urgency to embrace or explain. Just presence, dense and unyielding, like fog filling the corners of a once clear room. Her mother's room had remained untouched since the stroke dust settled on calendars left to the wrong month, drawers preserving the scent and fabrics of old Sundays. A scarf lay folded in a familiar curl, the kind her mother had worn to church without fail. The room had become a shrine, not to grief, but to waiting. And now it held her sister, returned after so long, choosing that space with its heavy suspended time. The door stayed closed. The light within rarely flickered on. The boy asked who she was. The answer was simple. She was family. He didn't question again. Children sensed the places where silence was supposed to fall. Days began folding into a rhythm that wasn't quite new but wasn't old either. She barely left the room, emerging only for meals, and even then kept a cautious distance. Her gaze wandered, not restlessly, but searching along the ceiling, the wall's texture, and the aging photographs near the television. She moved like someone looking for traces of something she hadn't yet decided to name. Once, she stood at the edge of the narrator's doorway, unaware she was being seen. Her presence rearranged the atmosphere. Nothing she said or did overtly disturbed the house, but small changes bloomed from her return. The husband extended his working hours without comment. The son lingered more at a neighbor's home. Even the cat, formerly devoted to the warmth outside her door, found new resting spots. Late one night, she was found sitting at the kitchen table, thumbing through a forgotten photo album that had long disappeared into storage. Her fingers stopped on a page heavy with two girls beneath cherry blossoms, dressed in yellow stitched by their mother's hands. It wasn't a moment designed for nostalgia, but one that revealed the layers left untouched for too long. The past began to bleed into the present, unsettling the spaces meant to remain still. 13 years had passed without a word from her. No notes, no calls. Her exit had been final in every way that mattered. She had walked out with a suitcase and nothing else, leaving behind only questions carefully folded into silence. The family had been told to let her go, and so they had. Yet now she was back, not so much asking to be part of things as simply existing within them again. There was no declared reason, no apology, and no confrontation, just the slow reemergence of old shadows cast by familiar steps. Signs surfaced quietly. A pair of earrings that wasn't recognizable. A borrowed coat that appeared in the closet, then vanished. A book out of place, its spine bending toward a title long unread. None of these were confirmations, only pieces. But it was enough to awaken a sense of vigilance. Then came the photo, hidden behind a mirror, dusted but intact. It held an image from before the lines on her husband's face had deepened him, young, standing next to her sister. They weren't touching, weren't overtly intimate. Yet the way the space between them barely existed lingered in her mind long after the image was tucked away. She said nothing, not to him, not to her. The silence expanded, not as a void, but as a choice. Observations turned into quiet calculations. Her husband made no mention of the missing photo. If he noticed, he chose to let it slip from view. Time crept forward with a weighted slowness. Her sister remained in their mother's room. Her husband vanished earlier and returned later each day. The boy became quieter, slipping into fewer questions. Tasks filled the space between noticing and folding laundry, packing lunches, and maintaining dinner rituals that were comforting only by their repetition. The quiet, once heavy with expectation, began to settle again, familiar in its discomfort. And then, without notice, her sister disappeared. Her room was left clean, the bed smoothed, and her coat and shoes gone. No note, no trace, just her absence, sharper than her presence had ever been. The narrator searched, checking the closet, the laundry, and even behind cabinet doors, as if something small might have been accidentally left behind. But the house had been returned to its previous state. Or nearly. At dinner, her son's glance toward the empty chair was brief but knowing. He didn't speak, nor did she. That night, she lingered at the edge of her bed, unmoving. The window had been left slightly open, and the cold air seeped through the crack. She didn't reach to close it. Instead, she let the cold sit with her. Let it remind her that something had shifted, though nothing had broken. It wasn't about the photo or the past. It was about the fragility of what had been constructed. How easily things could be shaken by something as simple as a return. Not by conflict or accusation, but by the quiet weight of a presence, heavy with unsaid things. And then, just as suddenly as she came, her sister was gone. Morning came quietly, indifferent to absence. The sky was a blank sheet, pale and unmoved, as if nothing had changed. She rose with the same boiling water for tea, sorting the mail that no longer held surprises, and preparing her son's lunch with the precision of habit. Yet the silence in the house was louder now, no longer just quiet but hollow, as if something essential had been removed and the structure was adjusting around the void. The door to her mother's room remained closed, but it felted now, no longer occupied, just closed out of reflex. She stood before it for a moment that morning, hand hovering near the handle, then turned away without touching it. She could feel the absence pressing out from behind it, as though even the dust had noticed someone was gone. The scarf was still in the drawer, the calendar still read the wrong month. But that morning, she changed it, not in ceremony, not in mourning, but because something in her required the page to turn. She folded the scarf carefully, slowly, with a deliberate kind of reverence. It felt like she was folding away something mucher, grief perhaps, or memory. The act was small, but its weight lingered in her fingertips. She left the window open longer than usual, letting the thin winter air move through the room. It carried no scent, nod, just stillness. Outside, the snow had barely covered the lawn, a quiet film of white clinging to the uneven grass. Not enough to transform the world, just enough to remind it that change had arrived. Her husband remained unchanged, at least outwardly. He moved through his routines with the same distant steadiness coat on, briefcase in hand, and a nod before disappearing out the door. If he felt the shift in the house, he didn't show it. Or perhaps he did, in the subtleties, the longer pauses at the sink, the deeper furrows in his brow, the slightly altered routes he took through the rooms. The photograph never reappeared. She hadn't returned it. It stayed hidden where she placed it, tucked in the darkness where memory lived quiet and unspoken. She looked at it once more, alone in the late afternoon, the light bending through the hallway, catching only the edges. It hadn't changed, but her way of seeing it had. She thought often about her sister's final morning, not out of regret, but from a place of curiosity. The absence of a note felt deliberate, not careless. Her sister had arrived without words and left in the same way, her silence not withholding but complete. It felt less like an ending and more like an answer, given in a language only memory could translate. Still, questions drifted through her mind in idle moments. Had she come to say goodbye or to ask something unspoken? Was her presence meant to stir something or simply to remind? The house offered no answers, only the continued rhythm of days moving forward. She noticed eventually that the light fell differently in her mother's room, as if the act of folding the scarf and changing the calendar had altered the air. The shadows no longer clung so tightly to the corners. Dust caught in the light now, drifting like small, aimless birds. The cat returned to its old resting spot by the heater, curling back into its coil of warmth without hesitation. Her son resumed his usual patterns, no longer glancing toward the empty chair. Children adapt without the need for closure, their resilience built into their very being. He had accepted her sister's presence and her disappearance without the burden of explanation. The narrator resumed her routines, but they no longer felt automatic. Each act, pouring tea, folding a blanket, wiping a countertop, held a new sense of attention, as though she were preserving something invisible in the process. Life had resumed, yes, but it now carried an echo, soft but persistent. Some evenings, she stood at the kitchen window and looked into the yard. The thin snow had melted in patches, revealing the grass beneath, dry and uneven. The wind stirred the branches in slow, irregular movements. Lights flickered in the neighbor's window, warm but distant. She thought often of her, not in the way she had before, with avoidance or sorrow, but with a calm kind of wonder. What had she seen when she stood in the doorways, stared at the photos, and wandered the halls? Had she found closure in the silence? Or had she left because the answer she sought was never going to be spoken aloud? She remembered the way her sister had stood in the doorway of her room when she thought she was alone. There had been something in that, not guilt, not longing, but recognition, as though she had returned to take one last look at the version of her life that had unfolded without her. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. The memory of the photo remained, not as a wound, but as a weight. Something that existed and had to be carried. The closeness captured in that single frame spoke to a time no one had been brave enough to name. The truth had hung in the background for years, untouched and unconfirmed, but present nonetheless. Her sister had not needed to explain, and she had not asked. The distance between knowing and admitting had been maintained, not out of cowardice, but out of preservation. Now, with her gone, that distance felt less significant. The truth, whatever it was, had passed through the house like a quiet storm, rearranging what it touched, but leaving the structure intact. The silence she left behind was no longer heavy. It moved through the house like a second breath, unseen but always felt. It accompanied her in quiet moments, in the creak of floorboards, and in the shifting light against the wall. Winter deepened outside. The air thinned further, the grass yellowed beneath the frost, but inside the house held steady. She no longer waited at windows or doors. She no longer traced the outline of memories in photo albums. She lived instead with the presence of what had been and the soft weight of what had never been said. In the end, her sister had left the way she lived with quiet certainty, with the power to alter everything without needing to say a word. And the house, changed in the subtlest ways, continued to hold its silence, not as a burden, but as a truth.